Okay, so we're in Exodus chapter 20, and God spoke all these words, saying, I am the Lord your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of slavery. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image or any likeness of anything that is in heaven above, or that is in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers on the children to the third and the fourth generation of those who hate me, but showing steadfast love to thousands of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain, for the Lord will not hold him guiltless who takes his name in vain. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Honor your father and mother, that your days may be long in the land the Lord your God is giving you. You shall not commit murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife or his male servant or his female servant or his ox or his donkey or anything that is your neighbor's. Now, when all the people saw the thunder and the flashes of lightning and the sound of the trumpet and the mountains smoking, the people were afraid and trembled, and they stood far off and said to Moses, you speak to us and we will listen, but do not let God speak to us, lest we die. Moses said to the people, do not fear, for God has come to test you, that the fear of him may be before you, that you may not sin. The people stood far off while Moses drew near to the thick darkness where God was. And we thank God for these words. We're going to think about the Ten Commandments, and I think there's there's many important reasons, but I want us to think under these two headings. Firstly, ethics. We've been thinking on Tuesday nights about the basics of the Christian life, and we've been thinking very much about theology, what it is the Bible teaches and we as Christians believe. And our ethics, that is how we behave, flows from our theology. Ethics are how we conduct ourselves, how we make decisions. And we often think of ethics in the context of the big ethical questions of the day. Should we have nuclear weapons? Should we decriminalize drugs? Should we allow euthanasia for people at the end of their lives? And these are ethical issues. But there are everyday ethical issues. Should I lie on my tax return? Should I tell the truth to my husband or my wife? Should I tell the truth or lie to my children? Should I take things from work, even if I'm not using them for work purposes? So all the time we're making ethical decisions, and the Ten Commandments will inform our ethics. And I've put here Reformed theology as well. Free Church is a Reformed church. We go back, we trust to the apostles, but in more recent history to the time of the Reformation. And some of the distinctives of the Free Church are those of the Reformed church. And as we go through the Ten Commandments, we'll think about things like, why are there no statues or paintings in the church? Why do we think Sunday is a special day? Why don't we necessarily have all these different days in the Christian calendar that other churches have? And a lot of that is to do with the application of the Ten Commandments to the worship of the church. Before we begin, let's remember we're not under law, we're under grace. And this is a quote from Kevin DeYoung in this book, which I've been reading this week, The Ten Commandments. And he's got this great quote. He says, salvation is not the reward for obedience. Salvation is the reason for obedience. And I think that's really important. We get that right at the start, that we don't obey the Ten Commandments because we think that if we do, we will be saved. And Israel never thought that. If you remember that reading there, it was after God had saved them from slavery that he gave them the Ten Commandments. So they were saved and then they were called to obey. And that's the same with us. We're We're not saved by our obedience, we're saved by Christ's obedience, but we are saved for obedience to him and to his word. If you love me, he says, you will obey my commands. And we really can't underestimate the enormous influence of the Ten Commandments in Western culture. They have an enormous influence in the church. Here's a church, and I think the Ten Commandments are on the wall. You can see it there. It seems to be in French, but there's Exodus 20, and the Ten Commandments. And maybe you've seen that in churches, written on the walls, maybe in gold leaf, the Ten Commandments. Historically, when people were brought forward for baptism as adults, they would undergo a time of catechism. They'd be taught the Christian faith, young people or adults, and they would often be taught three things in addition to the teaching of the Bible. They'd be taught the Lord's Prayer, the Apostles' Creed, and the Ten Commandments. So these are hugely formative teachings, really part of the warp and woof of Christian living. And if I were to ask you, I'm not going to, but if I were to ask you, what are the Ten Commandments? I'm sure many of us would be able to recite them all, but there would be a time in the church's history where people would have memorized them by rote, and that was just part of your basic Christian instruction. And they've had a huge influence in the wider society. This is a civic building, I think, in the south of America, and there you have the Ten Commandments carved outside. And as we know, if people actually obeyed the Ten Commandments, we wouldn't need the police, we wouldn't need the criminal justice system, we wouldn't need locks on our door, internet passwords, things like that. And many people, like to have these in civic places to remind people of God's law. I've written at the bottom here the Westminster Confession of Faith. It's chapter 19, the Shorter Catechism and the Larger Catechism, because there's actually a huge amount of teaching, particularly in the Larger Catechism, about the Ten Commandments and their application. And that would be true of many of the Reformed confessions. They would have a section dealing with the commandments individually. So tonight there's going to be quite a lot of quotation from these things. It's quite heavy, but hopefully we'll be able to go back and read it and digest it in our own time, and we can think about these things. Now, when we come to the law of Moses and its relationship to the gospel, you will find different churches have perhaps a different understanding of the relationship of the law given to Moses there in Exodus and its place with reference to the new covenant Christian believers. Just to say as we start, the law of Moses, from a Reformed perspective, is often seen as having a threefold division. There is the moral law, the ethical teaching. There is the ceremonial law, that is the instruction concerning the priests and the tabernacle and so on. And there are the judicial laws given to the nation of Israel. And we'll think about in a second how in Reformed thought, the moral law continues to have a bearing on the New Testament Christian, but the ceremonial and the judicial have been abrogated. Christ is our priest. We no longer have a priesthood, and the church is not a nation state. It is a body of believers from every nation. But the moral law is very important, and a Reformed theologian would say that it still has an importance, a relevance to the Christian believer. And by the moral law, we often mean the Ten Commandments or the Decalogue, which we've just read in Exodus 20 and Deuteronomy chapter 5. That's what we're going to think about today. This threefold division is, not every Christian in the world would agree on it, but the Westminster Confession says this: beside the law commonly called moral, God was pleased to give to the people of Israel as a church underage ceremonial laws containing typical ordinances of worship prefiguring Christ. Next, it says to them also as a body politic he gave sundry judicial laws which expired together with the state of that people, not obliging any other now further than the general equity thereof may require. So what they're effectively saying is that the ceremonial law, the judicial law is done away with, but the moral law continues to have relevance. If you're interested in exploring that question further, Christian Focus have published this wonderful book by Philip Ross, who may be known to some of us, may be related, in fact, to some of us, and is a wonderful guy, a friend of mine, and he's written this book, The Biblical and Theological Basis for the Threefold Division of the Law, and you can borrow that if you'd like to read it in more detail. But let's think about the Decalogue. Let's think about the 10 Commandments. And I think when we read Exodus and Deuteronomy, we see there is a kind of uniqueness to the 10 Commandments. They are distinguished from all the other laws in the Old Testament. Firstly, chapter 20, they are spoken in the hearing of all Israel. Before the people plead with Moses for God not to speak with them, they all hear the 10 Commandments. These commandments are written by God himself, the 2 tablets of stone. It is by the finger of God they are written. And it's these 2 tablets, stone tablets, that are preserved in the Ark of God. This is a replica of the Ark, but in the days of Moses, you have the tabernacle and you have the Ark right in the middle of the tabernacle, the most holy place. It was the dwelling place of God. And the 2 tablets of stone were inside the Ark, a reminder of the covenant God had made with his people. So there were many laws, but the 10 Commandments occupy this place of preeminence, this kind of central spot in the law, spoken to everyone, written by God himself, the tablets preserved in the Ark. Just as an aside, you've maybe heard of this place, Aksum, in Ethiopia. It was under siege, actually, by the military a few weeks ago, and there was a terrible amount of bloodshed. And the reason is, in this church, it's believed by the Ethiopian Orthodox Church that the Ark of the Covenant resides. There's one Orthodox priest who watches over it, and their tradition says that the Ark of the Covenant was actually taken from Israel into Ethiopia some time ago, and that's a very important site to them. I'm not in any position to adjudicate that story, but it's been in the news. Maybe you heard the name of Aksum, and that's why people were so keen to defend the church, because they believe that the Ark of the Covenant, in fact, is there in the north of Ethiopia. But going back to Westminster Confession, and they say in 1905, the framers of the Confession, that the moral law abides forever, justified person as well as others to the obedience thereof, not only in regard of the matter contained in it, but also in respect to the authority of God the Creator. Neither doth Christ in the gospel any way dissolve, but much strengthen this obligation. So what they're saying is, as Christians, we are to obey the commandments, not in order to be saved, but because we have been saved. These are the instructions, the law given by the Creator to all of mankind. And it's interesting when you get to the New Testament to see how Jesus and the apostles reference the 10 Commandments. The rich ruler comes to Jesus, Luke 18, and he says, "What must I do to inherit eternal life?" And Jesus says, verse 20, "You know the commandments. Do not commit adultery, don't murder, don't steal," and so on. So when this guy is asking what it looks like to live a righteous life, Jesus says, well, here's a summary in the 10 Commandments. When he's in the temple, Mark 12, and he's disputing with people, and one of them says, which commandment is the most important of all? And Jesus summarizes the commandments, verses 30 and 31, to love God with all your heart and soul and mind and strength, and love your neighbor as yourself. So Jesus, on one hand, points to the commandments as the ethical requirement of the people of God, but also points to their fulfillment, to their summary in his teaching. Interestingly, Paul uses the 10 Commandments as well. To the Ephesians, he says, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother. This is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you and you may live long in the land." So when he's teaching Christian families about their responsibilities to each other, he points them to the commandments. And again, he sees the commandments being summed up and fulfilled in the Christian era. The commandments, "You shall not commit adultery, nor murder, nor steal, nor covet," and any other commandment are summed up in this word, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. So when we come to the New Testament, we need to think of certain things. Firstly, Jesus didn't come to abolish the law, but instead to fulfill it. That is to say, he himself perfectly kept the law. This is the quote at the bottom is from Matthew Henry, who says this: he in all respects yielded obedience to the law, honored his parents, sanctified the Sabbath, prayed, gave alms, and did that which never anyone else did, obeyed perfectly, and never broke the law in anything. So Jesus is perfectly righteous. He fulfilled the law, and in dying for sin, he is able to declare us righteous and grant to us his righteousness. And that's just a little summary of where we got to. Therefore, Christ has fulfilled the law. As Christians, we are not under the law, but grace. And yet, in the New Covenant, the law is written on our hearts. That was the promise in the Old Testament, not that we would be free from any laws, but that God would write it not on tablets of stone, but on the tablets of our hearts, that we might obey the law as saved people. And the summary of the law, the fulfillment of the law, is love. If we love Christ, we will obey his commands, and his commands are to love God and to love our neighbor as ourself. So it is the law of love. What then is the role of the law in the Christian's life? And again, back to the confession, chapter 19, verse 6. Although true believers be not under the law as a covenant of works, to be thereby justified or condemned, yet it is of great use to them, as well as to others, in that as a rule of life, informing them of the will of God and their duty, it directs and binds them to walk accordingly, discovering also the sinful pollutions of their nature, hearts, and lives. So as examining themselves thereby, they may come to further conviction of, humiliation for, and hatred against sin, together with a clearer sight of the need they have of Christ and the perfection of his obedience. And they're quick to add that neither are the aforementioned uses of the law contrary to the grace of the gospel, but do sweetly comply with it, the Spirit of Christ subduing and enabling the will of man to do that freely and cheerfully, which the will of God revealed in the law requireth to be done. So we're going to think about these different uses of the law. We've thought about the threefold division of the law, and now we're going to think about these different uses of the law. They're clear that we can't be saved by the law, but it is useful. Firstly, this is from the larger catechism, question 95, and it gives us a picture. It informs us, the second paragraph, of the holy nature and will of God and of our duty, binding them to walk accordingly, to convince them of their disability to keep it, the sinful pollution of their nature, hearts, and lives, and thereby to give us a clearer sight of the need they have for Christ and the perfection of his obedience. So what he's saying is the law tells us that God is holy. It shows us the requirements, the righteous requirements he has of us. We know from our own experience we fall short of those. And so the law shows us our sin. It's like a mirror that shows up our sin, but also teaches us how much we need the righteous one, Christ, to forgive us our sin. And that's particularly true in the 96th question of unregenerate men. The moral laws of use to unregenerate men, so if somebody's not a Christian, to help awaken their consciences to flee from the wrath to come, to drive them to Christ, or upon their continuance in the state and way of sin, to leave them inexcusable and under the curse thereof. Really, he's saying that when we look at the Ten Commandments, we are conscious that we aren't quite as good as we think we are. And one evangelist who's used this in recent years is a New Zealander called Ray Comfort, who's a kind of dynamic evangelist. He's got quite a big internet ministry, but he does a lot of cold contact evangelism in the States. And he's produced a whole range of very creative tracts, which have the law, the Ten Commandments written on them. And his tactic is to go up to people and say, do you think you're a good person? And most of us, if we're honest, think we are good people. And he says, well, let's look at the Ten Commandments. And he talks them through the 10, he says, how many of these have you broken? You know, have you ever told a lie? Have you ever stolen anything? Have you ever this, that, and the other, taken the Lord's name in vain? And pretty quickly, people recognize that they have broken, probably all of them. And Ray then says, well, you know, you're not as good as you think, and you're certainly not good enough for God. And he uses that as a way to point people to Christ. And I think that's what the confession is speaking about, that as we look at the 10 Commandments, we realize how far short we have fallen and how much we need someone to forgive us. As Christians, having been forgiven, the next question deals with that and says, what is the use of the moral law to the regenerate? Very clear, we're not justified by it, neither justified nor condemned, but it is of special use, in italics, to show them how much they are bound to Christ for his fulfilling it and enduring the curse thereof in their stead and for their good, and thereby to provoke them to more thankfulness, to express the same in their greater care, to conform themselves thereunto as the rule of their obedience. So we're grateful to Christ that he has taken the curse of the law for us. He has forgiven us our sins, and we look to the law to know how we might obey him in gratitude for the salvation that is ours. For the Latin scholars among us, of whom I'm not one, often spoken these different uses of the law. It teaches us the will of God, the usus enclecticus, I think. It restrains us by reminding us of the consequences of disobedience, the usus politicus, and the law is an instrument in the hands of the Holy Spirit by which he teaches us to understand and to do God's will, the usus renatus. One Reformed writer says this: the moral law is the rule of perfect righteousness. The Decalogue reveals God's will and tells us how we must grow in love for him and for our neighbour. Christ appointed the law as a godly and righteous rule of the living, as the appointed instrument of sanctification that instructs us in righteousness. Because God is holy, righteous, perfect, good, and gracious, his will is holy, righteous, perfect, good, and gracious. He is not pleased with any other righteousness than that which conforms to the requirements of his will. Through the law we may learn obedience, freedom, perfect righteousness, and order. So the law is not there for our justification, that is through Christ, but is an appointed instrument of our sanctification, instructing us in righteousness. And just to underline that point, salvation is not the reward for obedience. Salvation is the reason for obedience. The law, an instrument of sanctification, showing us what obedience looks like, what it means to live a life holy and pleasing to God. Okay, well, that's quite a heavy study, quite a lot of 17th